The final chapter on JFK, Chapter 8, Segment 4, Parkland.
Welcome back. This is Segment 4, Parkland Memorial Hospital. After Kennedy was shot, the limousine he was in took him straight to Parkland Memorial Hospital, just a few minutes away. He was rushed in. They tried their best to revive him, but he died. And Parkland Memorial, from that point on, has always had the stigma of the place where John F. Kennedy died. But Parkland was also a place of significant importance because after Kennedy was pronounced dead, events, actions, and evidence just got plain weird. And when I say weird, I mean bizarre, beyond strange. For instance, when the limo with JFK arrived at Parkland Memorial Hospital at approximately 12:35 p.m., 5 minutes after the first shot, Kennedy was pulled out of the car. Conley was pulled out of the car, who was also shot. Kennedy was taken to Trauma Room 1. Conley was taken to Trauma Room 2, and a group of 12 doctors started working on both gunshot victims. Unfortunately, it was pretty clear from the outset that John F. Kennedy was not going to make it. The weird part is trailing behind the Kennedy limo was the vice president in his limo, chasing the motorcade. When he got to Parkland, instead of realizing that there was a problem and getting away from the hospital, Johnson and his wife go into the hospital with Senator Ralph Yarborough kind of walking around outside the building. Secret Service protocol. And the reason there is a vice president is to act as a backup for the President of the United States. There's no other purpose for a vice president aside from casting a deciding vote in the Senate in the event of a tie. So, with Kennedy shot, instead of getting Johnson away from the scene, his driver and Johnson go to the scene, and Johnson spends close to the next hour in the hospital outside the doorway where Kennedy is being worked on. Johnson wasn't there to help. He certainly didn't have any medical skill. And he wasn't there as a visitor because he couldn't go into either trauma room. So there was no logical, no rational, no reasonable purpose to jeopardize this country by taking the vice president to a scene where trauma with the president is occurring. Johnson should have been taken away, and the vehicles should have never gone to Parkland, but rather probably in the opposite direction. Consistent with this, at 1 o'clock, Kennedy was pronounced dead. Around that time, he was given the last rites by a priest. Depending upon which record you read, Johnson was told about Kennedy's death either at 1:15, 1:13, 1:20. It doesn't really make any difference, except what Johnson was told. The very first thing he did was he turned to his wife, and with her little notebook, he said, "Make a note of that time." And of course, rather than leaving at that moment, knowing that Kennedy's dead, Johnson still stays at the hospital. And he says, according to the Secret Service records, which we're going to run right here, he's not going to leave the hospital until the Secret Service approves it. So he remains, and when they finally convince him to leave the hospital and to get back to the plane and to get out of Dallas, Lyndon Johnson starts walking out with his group, and he stops, and he sends an aide back to Trauma Room 1 to make sure John Kennedy is dead. When the aide comes back to confirm the death, Johnson then agrees to leave. At 1:35, 1 hour after Kennedy had arrived at Parkland, Johnson leaves Parkland Hospital with the Dallas police chief, Jesse Curry, who should be the busiest man in Dallas, driving him back to Love Field. The second weird, bizarre, strange, crazy event that happened at Parkland is that the trauma doctors that were in Kennedy's room working on him, and those that were around him while the others were working on him, all noticed that Kennedy had what they thought was a bullet wound in the front of his body at his throat. As any emergency room doctor who sees trauma victims, especially gunshot victims, they can generally tell the difference between a bullet entry wound and a bullet exit wound. The lead doctor, after Kennedy's death, in a press conference, stated that he thought there was a bullet wound that entered at Kennedy's throat from the front. Within seconds of him completing his statement, a Secret Service or an FBI agent came up to him and threatened him and said to never make that claim again. And of course, as was shown in the documentary, JFK, What the Doctors Saw, very great documentary, and you might want to watch it, where the doctors discuss the fact that they all thought Kennedy had been shot from the front, but they were all terrified for the next 50 years to say anything about it because they were fearful of being killed. When we're talking weird, let's go one step further. Warren Commission Exhibit 399, the magic or miracle bullet that was able to clean itself, was able to go through supposedly Kennedy and Conley almost completely unmarred, and somehow was able to be linked up to the rifle that Lee Harvey Oswald allegedly bought to kill Kennedy. Yet in Parkland, another bizarre event, the bullet was found on a stretcher that neither Kennedy or Conley were ever on, and in fact was found on a different floor than where the men were. When the Warren Commission went after the two men, hospital employees, one I believe was the director of the hospital, about the location of where this bullet was found, they tried to shake their testimony, and neither man would budge, stating with certainty that the bullet they found was not anywhere near the area or areas that either Kennedy or Conley had ever been in. A little weird. After President Kennedy was pronounced dead, one of the trip's organizers became president. Someone found Warren Commission Exhibit 399, the magic or miracle bullet, at Parkland on a stretcher that neither Kennedy or Conley had been on a different floor. And the bullet had cleaned itself and basically, except for a little bit, was completely unmarred and eventually was tracked all the way back to the rifle that Lee Harvey Oswald supposedly bought and shot Kennedy with. The doctors at Parkland, the primary physician, was told to keep his mouth shut and to not talk about any shot hitting Kennedy from the front. Never talk about it again. He was threatened. And the rest of the doctors, for the next 50 years, were so terrified, they never talked about it either. Until this recent documentary. Lyndon Johnson, as the new president of the United States, being at Parkland, stating that it was a world crisis, being concerned for the safety of all Americans, perhaps a nuclear war, having empathy towards the president, the dead president, and his wife, his injured friend, walks out of Parkland Memorial Hospital on his way to Kennedy's plane, and if you look, there's nothing in his hand. Here's a photo of him coming out of the Texas Hotel just a few hours earlier. The significance of that hat is that in the midst of a world crisis, 7 hours later, Lyndon Johnson will have his first mad-on or temper tantrum as the new president of the United States, when he should be worrying about all these other matters. He blows up at the Secret Service for forgetting his hat at Parkland Memorial in the midst of this world crisis. Now, if you don't believe me, a couple more segments, I will show you the Secret Service report on it. See you soon.